The Black Death utterly transformed European society almost overnight. There is no way to overstate, I think, the impact socially, economically, politically, culturally, anything you can think of. The Black Death impacted it and changed it.
This is Dr. Dorsey Armstrong. She is a professor of English and medieval literature at Purdue University. And today, Dr. Armstrong took some time to discuss a devastating historical event that completely and utterly changed our financial and economic history. This is the story of how the Black Death transformed Europe. The Black Death was a devastating global epidemic of the bubonic plague. Beginning in 1347, the disease would spread rapidly across medieval society. It is estimated to have killed between 75 and 200 million people. I mean, just for context, the world population in 1300 was 392 million people, which means that nearly half of the world's population just died, disappeared in the span of a few years. But here's the thing. Many historians believe that the devastating event also paved the way for a lot of progress. Let's look at the world at the start of the plague. It's no coincidence that the world's population exploded during the medieval times. You see, between the years 900 and 1300, the world's climate grew warmer and wetter. This meant longer crop growing seasons, allowing farmers to grow more food. And with more food, there was also a growth in population, especially in Europe.
Let's look at 1340, so just before the plague. We've had this increase in population in the European world starting around the year 1000. So between 1000 and 1300, we estimate that the population of Europe doubled from about 75 million to 150 million people. And that increase that quickly means that suddenly there are not enough resources to go around.
Now, land, after all, was finite. Competition for resources began to increase, and so did the power of landowners. Able fighting-age men could hope for some degree of social mobility, but for everybody else, life was getting more difficult, and their access to resources was diminishing.
So those people who are in power want to make sure that they maintain resources for their families, for people who look like them, for people who believe as they do in terms of their faith. And so you start to see, say, non-mainstream Christians like the Cathars get persecuted. And really, it's not so much about religious faith as it is about, we want their stuff. Let's take their land. That's oversimplifying it, but other groups get marginalized. Women, for example, were enjoying an unusual amount of autonomy and power and prestige until we hit about the 13th century. And suddenly women who were allowed to do things like go on preaching tours. Hildegard of Bingen is a famous example.
Also known as Saint Hildegard, she lived during the 12th century. She achieved remarkable progress in her life, becoming an influential religious figure, poet, musician, and writer. But sadly, examples like her would become less common at the turn of the 13th century. In general, life for women became far more restrictive at that time.
Suddenly women are, no, you have to stay at home, you can't own property. And so restrictions are happening all over society. And it's not incorrect to say it is white Christian men who say, this is all ours, everyone else go to the margins. In any event, so you have this land crunch, you have very few resources available to an increasingly large population in 1340.
Now, you might be wondering, why did the peasants keep up with these increasing restrictions imposed on them? Couldn't some of them just escape and start their own little commune? You have to realize that this was centuries before the Industrial Revolution. You simply couldn't find a place and turn it into a lush farmland. The best lands had often been worked on for generations to ensure that crops could grow there optimally. In addition, there was also this threat of bandits, wild animals, and even famine that an independent commune would have to face by themselves. And ironically, working as a serf for a noble actually afforded relative safety and a better means of survival.
Imagine you're a peasant in, say, the 12th century in England, and you are beholden to a certain lord. You live on his land. You can't leave that land. The land that you work and your own property essentially belongs to the lord. Would you rather be free to go wherever you want, or would you rather stay in that situation where you are bound to live in a certain place and do a certain amount of labor and service for someone who ranks above you?
The concept of freedom is always a fascinating topic, and how we view the concept of freedom vastly varies depending on which time period we're talking about, which geography, which social context we're in. So, is freedom always a good thing?
All of my students in the US will always say, well, I would like to be free. And I say, no, you would not. The first question a peasant would ask is, how much land do I get? And how much of the crops do I get to keep for myself? How much control do I have? And so being free or unfree, while it's a very sort of US kind of idea that freedom in the Middle Ages, much more practically speaking, all you care about is how much land you have control over. So you might be perfectly happy to be a serf and absolutely beholden to a lord. If you have a ton of land, you get to work. So that's one of the first things you have to understand when you're thinking about the medieval mindset, especially before we have the boom in urbanism and trade later in the 14th and 15th century, is that in an agrarian society, land and livestock is everything.
But all of this was about to change drastically in just a few years' time. Italian merchants fleeing the Mongols in Crimea brought with them an unknown yet highly deadly disease. As they landed in Italy, transmission across Europe was rapid, arriving only in England a year later.
Overnight, literally, the Black Death arrives. It seems to have originated in a location near the Tian Shan Mountains, probably a century earlier than we thought it did. And I can go into the mechanisms by which plague is spread, and that would take us another 2 hours. But suffice it to say, the main vector of transmission is the black rat flea. The reason plague was so tricky and sneaky is that plague reservoirs could live in black rat colonies that are just adjacent to human populations for decades without any impact until something happened to that rat colony where it died off and the fleas had to find another host. And it did not. It started here near sort of the Black Sea and then spread eastwards to China and westwards into Europe.
If you caught this disease, your chances of survival was slim. Living conditions at the time were far less hygienic, and medical knowledge was primitive at best. Literally, your best option at the time was to pray that the plague didn't get you as the next victim. This means that the impact on the overall population was absolutely devastating.
When it did strike, starting in about 1347, between 1347 and 1353, it's now estimated that half the population died of plague. And if you contracted plague, you had an 18 to 20% chance of surviving, and that was only if you had the bubonic form. The other forms, pneumonic and septicemic, you were dead. There was really no coming back from that.
As the plague subsided, it left entire settlements and their fields completely depopulated. Crops rotted and animals starved to death simply because there was no inhabitants left to take care of them. However, for those that did survive, well, there were witnesses to an extraordinary economic transformation that would reshape Europe.
The Black Death utterly transformed European society almost overnight. There is no way to overstate, I think, the impact socially, economically, politically, culturally, anything you can think of. The Black Death impacted it and changed it.
And ironically, there's one class of survivors from the plague that did not benefit whatsoever.
One historian has said pretty much everybody who survived was better off except for the landowners. Because up to this point, because there's a land crunch and people are desperate, and there's also been a famine or two in the lead up to the plague, landowners have all the power. Now suddenly they have tons of land and there are not enough bodies to work the land. So lower class serfs and peasants, for the first time in over 100 years, have the ability to ask for higher wages, to leave the land that they've been working for a particular lord, go down the road to the other lord who says, I need you to get my harvest in. I will give you a greater percentage of the crops. I will give you more money. Please come this way.
You see, the plague was different from other factors that would normally lead to depopulation, like war. You see, war leads to destruction of resources, but the plague only went after people. Resources like buildings, farms, infrastructure all remained intact. It's just now that there are fewer people to maintain them. So the people who survived became more valuable, much more needed in society. And with that, we see a change in the dynamics of power in society.
In the aftermath of the Black Death, where there are more resources available, there are more opportunities for people who would have just 50 years before been born into the peasant class, stayed in the peasant class, died in the peasant class, married someone else in the peasant class. You have this mobility. People can move up the social ladder in a way they never could before. So for the 90% of society who were not nobles and who were not clergy, everything's better. You have more opportunities. You can write your own ticket. You have autonomy in a way you did not before.
Now, as you can imagine, kings and nobles didn't like this very much. In fact, some of them tried really hard to repress this bargaining power that these commoners now had.
Now, as always happens, the powers that be said, well, we can't have this. And so in England, for example, around 1350, a statute was passed known as the Statute of Laborers. And what it did is it froze wages at pre-plague levels. So it tried to ignore market forces and say, oh no, we're not going to pay attention to those. Wages are the same. And then it also restricted people from moving around the countryside. I said, you can't just be wandering the road and going to this next town over. You've got to have a permit, essentially, to do this. Because this was all in the interest of the great lords maintaining their property and their holding, maintaining control of the crops that they relied on to support their livelihoods.
But all of this effort to control the peasant class was now going in vain. It would prove futile. Not only was it impractical, but ordinary people were not in the same desperate situation as they were before. Now they could mobilize and advocate for their newfound rights, and if needed, they could revolt.
And you know that anytime someone is trying to pass a law or make rules that prevent people from doing a thing they can easily do, that's not going to last. It's going to change. So, for example, with the Statute of Laborers in 1350, no one was happy about this except for the upper classes. And in 1381, there is something in England called the Uprising of 1381, also called the Peasants' Revolt, where the lower classes say, we're not going to obey the strictures in the Statute of Laborers. We have opportunity. We want to make some money. We want social mobility. And so they burn down the Savoy Palace in London. They execute several of the king's officials, especially those associated with the exchequer. And things change after this. Whereas society goes back to giving lip service to the feudal order and the three estates model. But in reality, that's not what's happening. The lower classes are gaining power, independence, and more importantly, education. I would say that the Black Death is something that allowed a brilliant mind like Geoffrey Chaucer to exist. 100 years prior to that, Chaucer, who was the son of a vintner, would not have become a great poet. But with the resources freed up after the Black Death, it becomes possible for people to do things and have careers that they never could before.
That's right. In many ways, the Black Death marked the start of the end of the medieval ages. The feudal order that had defined the era for centuries was now crumbling. It relied on a solid foundation of a large labor pool at the bottom to keep those at the top comfortable. For a long time, the commoners remained subservient to their posts. People in those desperate conditions could rarely hope for anything better. And then there was the influence of the church. But just to get on the same page, let's do a quick refresher on what feudalism really was.
What feudalism describes is a hierarchical system that's shaped like a pyramid, and in it you have each level connected to the other through bonds of loyalty and protection and service. So at the top you would have the king. Below the king you would have the next level, which would be his leading barons who pledge fealty and loyalty to him, and in exchange he protects them, they fight for him, and they're in this mutually beneficial relationship. Those lords then have vassals below them, and then those lower ranking citizens would have subjects below them to get all the way to the bottom of the period, which is peasants and serfs, and they are serving the lord of a manor, and in exchange for his protecting them, helping them in times of famine or disease, they have to work his land and give him a certain amount of days of labor and percentage of their crops. That's essentially the system.
But the thing about a pyramid is that if the base is unstable, the structure will start to crumble. And that's exactly what happened with the Black Death. It completely unraveled this structure.
Once you have half of the population wiped out, clearly it's no longer a pyramid. The base is gone. And so feudalism gets compromised.
It wasn't just that the peasants were now free and could shop for better economic opportunities. In addition to that, there was now a rare window of time where they could even become landowners of large tracts of land just like the lords they had served before. Now, it turns out that land is valuable as long as there's enough people to work it and to extract resources from that land. And now, with so many people gone, many lords and nobles were now in possession of large quantities of land that they could not manage. So, with rising mobility and a growing, increasingly assertive middle class, a new system began to emerge and challenge the old order of feudalism. And this was market capitalism. And with it emerged a new class in society, the bourgeoisie. They comprised of merchants, guildmasters, entrepreneurs, and others who built their fortune through capital. In other words, wealth generated from trade and industry.
We have, among other things, the rise of a merchant class and a growth in urbanization that we hadn't seen since the days of the Roman Empire. There's an argument among many historians that if it hadn't been for this external force on the medieval world, it would have kept being medieval for another few hundred years.
Now, of course, the old aristocracy wasn't too pleased with these commoners who could now rival or even exceed them in wealth. In fact, the lines of separation were starting to get blurry. The wealth, the education, the increasing power, it started to really impact the nobles, and they started to actively resort to petty laws that would distinguish the gentry from the wealthy commoners.
You see a retrenching on the part of the upper classes where they're really worried that someone's going to confuse lower class people with them. So you have the rise of something called sumptuary laws, because the wives of merchants are making enough money that they can buy fancy clothes. And the fear is, you don't want to mistake the tailor's wife for a noble lady. So therefore, they can only have certain amounts of lace on their clothes. They can't wear certain colors. These are reserved for the upper classes. Certain kinds of furs, which are within their economic reach at this point. And so you don't want to deceive the upper classes or try and pass yourself off as something that you're not. The upper classes say, you can't wear these things. You can't own these things. You can't display these things because this is disrupting what we think of as the natural order of society.
Now, of course, such laws were very difficult to impose over the long term. The lines between the classes were beginning to blur, especially with intermarriages becoming more common. The various classes began to associate with each other, and a national identity began to emerge, displacing old identities such as bloodlines and religion that characterized the feudal times. This shift laid the groundwork for modern nation-states, fostering unity and a shared culture. Now, so far we talked about mostly how Europe had transformed following the Black Death. However, it must be noted that the Islamic world and the East Asia were hit just as hard. However, just like the European Dark Ages, the impacts on these regions are very difficult to trace because there are far fewer surviving sources.
So as far as we can tell, impacts on the Islamic world were just as severe, if not greater than the medieval European world. And in some cases, it seems to be that we didn't fully appreciate this because of the nature of the sources that exist. In a few instances in the medieval European world, we had people who were already keeping chronicles. And so when the Black Death happened, they would note what was happening in that year. And in fact, we have some chronicles in which someone has left a blank spot. It says, and the plague lasted until, and he left it blank because someone was going to fill it in. He thought he would, but he died of plague. So there's this blank spot. Whereas in the Muslim world, especially in North Africa, there are a couple chroniclers who are already writing and they detail it, but we just don't have as many sources.
And of those that still exist, most scholars have only just begun to study them. As a result, many aspects of how it impacted non-Western societies remain largely unexplored, contributing to an incomplete understanding of its global impact.
Also, for a very long time, the sources that did exist in these various worlds, so let's say from the Middle East, North Africa, and into Asia, scholars who study one don't have the ability to study the other. And so we're starting to learn more about how this was not just a European pandemic, but a truly global pandemic, because scholars are starting to talk to each other, come from different traditions. Resources are starting to be translated. And also archaeological evidence, especially the use of ancient DNA, is helping us to determine how far the plague spread and locations where we didn't fully appreciate that it existed until now.
Now, we talked quite a bit about the financial and economic impact of the plague, but there was also an equally important and lasting impact on a societal level. In fact, it might help explain why there's such a big divide in mindsets between Europeans and those in the United States, especially in regards to healthcare and the role of government.
What we never appreciated before this is the emotional toll that the Black Death must have taken on the population of Europe, especially because it wasn't a one and done event. It kept coming back in waves just about every generation or so until 1721. And every generation would then have to experience this trauma, this severe psychological trauma. In some cases, you survive the plague, you have children, they grow up, and then you watch them die. And so I don't think that we had fully appreciated until recently the impact that has psychologically on a society. And because of that, I think in European society today, the reason we have things like healthcare, like the National Health Service, we have charities and hospitals and other organizations to assist people when they need a social safety net, that came into existence as a direct result of the Black Death, when citizens said, we expect our government to take care of us. It is their job. And so they are very accustomed. And over hundreds of years, these networks came into existence. Some came into existence immediately after the first wave. In Italy, for example, charities set up funds to provide dowries for young women to get married, who otherwise would not have been able to get married because they recognized we need to repopulate.
Whereas in America...
But when you have the founding of the United States, there is this deliberate break with the European world and a desire to sort of do things differently. And part of that is the kind of quintessential rugged individualism of American society where you rely on yourself. You don't want to rely on charity. I think that that's part of the reason why US society hasn't managed to put into place a good national healthcare system, whereas in Europe, they have that and they have other support systems. And because people in the US were not dealing with that trauma of a recurring illness or pandemic that would wipe out the population and negatively impact society and businesses in the same way that they had for hundreds of years in Europe.
In economics, we have this concept called creative destruction. It's where the old is constantly being replaced by the new, paving the way for progress. The Black Death essentially accelerated the process of creative destruction in Europe. It dismantled an outdated feudal structure and ushered in an era of economic and social transformation. Now, this upheaval not only blurred the lines between social classes, but also laid the groundwork for modern economies. All of this illustrates just how the worst of crises can also drive innovation and reshape society for the better. Now, if you've made it this far into the video, I'd love it if you left a thumbs up emoji in the comments. Also, I'm really grateful to Dr. Armstrong's time in this interview. She's written a lot of amazing books and has a lot to share, so make sure to check out some of her work in the description of this video. By the way, if you haven't already, please do check out this video that I made about the DuPonts. I think you're gonna really enjoy it. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.